While piecing together the fragments of those who appear in this story, it steals over me that, like a clairvoyant, I know for each of them what the future holds and their ultimate destiny. It has been a sobering and thought-provoking experience. We start this tale in Scotland, on the Hebridian island of Jura. On Christmas Day, 1836, in the tiny, now abandoned hamlet of Achabrad, a 17-year-old lass named Catherine gave birth to her firstborn, a boy named Donald Malcolm McKechnie. Sometime around 1841, the family moved down the valley to a cottage named Bothan Beag in the equally tiny hamlet of Glengarrisdale. Here are some old photographs given to me by the family of the last people to live here in the early 20th century. Uncle Angus, a gamekeeper, is shown here with a still unexplained MacLean's skull, marked on the local map to this day. I first visited this spot in 2003, deposited on a rock with my gear by boat from the Scottish mainland, to be picked up 3 days later. Bothan Beag, meaning tree cottage, survives to this day due to being designated a bothy, or traveller's hut. I camped inside, laying my sleeping bag down on a bed of bracken. During my visit, I hiked up the glen to the ruined houses of Achabrad. Leaping ahead 7 years to 2010, I revisited Glengarrisdale aboard my Fleming 65 motor yacht, Venture 2, built in faraway Taiwan. Very little had changed since my great-grandfather lived here 160 years ago. By age 5, Donald moved to Lilt on the east side of the island, where he stayed with his grandparents. He went to the local school, where the use of the Gaelic language was forbidden. By 1861, he had left the island at age 25 for Glasgow, and by age 30, he was in Edinburgh, where, at the university, he became a scholar in the Gaelic language in both prose and poetry. He won many prizes for poetry between 1897 and 1901. Here is a book of his poems. He became known as the Bard of Jura, and there is a sign to this effect at the ferry landing at Feolin. In 1868, he married Elizabeth Jane Sutherland. Donald and Elizabeth lived in this house and had 8 children. Sadly, we have no pictures and few details of this generation, with the exception of Elizabeth Mary McKechnie, who married William Fleming in 1896. Here she is with her husband. The Flemings lived at Calmuir's farm, a few miles from the town of Falkirk, just west of Edinburgh. My father, Donald Malcolm Fleming, was born in this house in 1900. The farm offered bed and breakfast in 2003, and when I visited in that year, I believe I stayed in the very room in which he had been born. In 1904, the family moved all the way south to Cambridgeshire in East Anglia, where they had a farm called Haney. The Fleming family consisted of 2 girls, Alison and Elizabeth, shown here with their mother, and 4 boys, Donald, my father, Ernest, known as Bill, Roy, and Duncan. The 1418 war started. Donald and Duncan lied about their ages and signed up for the Royal Flying Corps. This is my father. He continued in the Air Force after the war, when it became the Royal Air Force. When he earned his wings and became a pilot officer, he received this impressive document, redolent in the language of empire. George, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and of the British dominions beyond the seas, King, Defender of the Faith, Emperor of India, etc. To our trusty and well-beloved Donald Malcolm Fleming, greetings. We, reposing especial trust and confidence in your loyalty, courage, and good conduct, do by these presents constitute and appoint you to be an officer in our Royal Air Force from the 27th day of May, 1925. You are therefore carefully and diligently to discharge your duty as such in the rank of pilot officer, or in such higher rank as we may from time to time hereafter be pleased to promote or appoint you. These biplanes are typical of those they flew. My father is second from the right in this photo. This image features the display of a dummy bombing raid over Wembley Stadium in 1926. The previous year, my father, leading the same display, had a narrow escape for which he received official commendation in the form of a mentioned in dispatches. This newspaper cutting describes another incident which he was lucky to survive. Roy went to Africa and sadly died of blackwater fever in Tanganyika in his early 20s. After the war came to an end, my father moved up through the ranks. His record, which I found online, shows that in 1925 through 27 he served in Mesopotamia, now Iraq, where the British forces put down local uprisings following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire after the end of the war. In 1928 he was back in England. He is the officer with the peaked cap. Between 1930 and 32 he was flying experimental planes at Martlesham Heath in Suffolk, England, where he met my mother, Hilda Foden, seen here with her mother and her father. Her family came from Lancashire in northwest England. Her father, Hubert Foden, owned cotton mills. My parents married at Bolton Abbey in Yorkshire in June 1932. I was born in a house called Light Hill on August the 19th, 1935. A few months later, the family traveled to Abu Swair in Egypt. Here is my mother in what can only be a bomb shelter. We returned to England and my father was promoted to squadron leader, and in 1937 made commanding officer of Hawkinge in Kent, on the south coast of England, a few miles from Dover. Sadly, it was time for another world war to follow the one that was supposed to end all wars, and my father's family was again caught up in it. Now a wing commander, my father was posted to Scotland, where he was commanding officer of RAF fighter base at Drem. We lived in nearby Gullin. My sister, Caroline, was born in Edinburgh. My father took command of 603 Squadron at RAF Turnhouse. The first German raid of the war targeted the massive Forth Bridge and also the shipyards at Rosyth, coincidentally only a few miles from where my father was born. A pilot from 603 Squadron shot down the first enemy aircraft of the war. Here is a letter in my father's handwriting describing the event. My Uncle Duncan was also in the RAF, and Uncle Bill joined the Navy. He was in Nassau, where he met the Duke of Windsor, the ex-King of England. Subsequently, his motor torpedo boat was captured by the Germans, and he became a prisoner of war for the remainder of the war. Here is a card sent from the prison camp, which reads, "My dearest mother, am still looking forward to your first letter. Auntie's is the only one to appear to date. Some of our crowd still have not heard, so I am fortunate. Others, again, have had 10 or more. I am keeping fit and cheery. Love to all, Bill." This is the reverse side of the postcard. The local postmistress cried when she saw it, as he had been listed as missing in action. This is his sister, my aunt, Alison, who was a volunteer in the Women's Volunteer Service. As shown in this cartoon, my father had now reached the rank of group captain. In the latter part of the war, he was posted to what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, which, due to the war, he had to reach by a long sea journey via South Africa and Kenya. The only photo I have of him in that posting is astride a polo pony. Finally, in 1945, the European war was over. Back at Haney, which I had visited during the war, my Aunt Elizabeth was confined to crutches and a wheelchair due to childhood polio, followed by being thrown out of a pony cart. She became a published poet and wrote several plays. I still have some of her books, looking a little the worse for wear. She wrote for the famous magazine Punch, and also for the BBC. Her name appears on the present-day internet and even has one entry on Amazon. My Uncle Ernest, known as Bill, went to British Guiana after returning home from his prison camp. He spent almost all his life searching for diamonds. He was never successful, but there was a book titled Diamond Fever written about him. During an interval in England to recover his health, a number of lurid newspaper articles appeared in the local paper. He died in Apega, British Guiana, in August 1974. My uncle Duncan, whom I also never met, moved to Kenya to grow sisal. After retiring from the RAF, my father also moved to Kenya. Initially he worked in locust control, spending months in the bush, tracking and eliminating the insects while still in the hopper stage before they could fly. He then moved to Timau, where he stayed with an ex-RAF friend. Timau is 7,000 feet up on the slopes of Mount Kenya, right on the equator. I climbed its third highest peak when I visited in 1969. My father stayed in this house. He cultivated pyrethrum, a daisy which produces a natural insecticide. He fished for trout in the stream, fed by the melting snow from the great mountain. Sadly, all that generation have now passed on, but their genes for travel, adventure, and the creative arts have surfaced in their descendants.